You are no longer part of this family. We will move on without you. Do not come back. Those were the exact words glowing on my phone screen in the dead of night. My own son. The boy I had carried on my shoulders. The man I had entrusted with the keys to my life's work. He had just erased me with a few careless taps of his thumb. I sat there in the heavy silence of a sterile, unfamiliar hotel room on the outskirts of Houston, the harsh light of the screen reflecting off my tired eyes. I did not scream. I did not throw the phone against the wall. I did not shatter the bedside lamp in a fit of rage. I simply stared at the message, took a long, slow breath, and typed a single word in reply. Okay, I hit send. Then I set the phone face down on the scratched laminate nightstand. What came next was a suffocating quiet, but inside my head everything was sharp and deliberate. Colin was convinced he'd won. He and Renee were certain they'd managed to discard a frail, powerless 75-year-old man. Earlier that day they had changed the locks on my own front door and thrust a forged medical power of attorney into my hands, and in their minds that was enough to finish me. They glanced at the gray in my hair and the hospital bracelet still on my wrist and decided I was beaten. That was their one fatal miscalculation. What they failed to remember was that I was the one who had raised that commercial real estate empire from bare ground. They had no idea who they were actually up against. I dug into my scuffed canvas duffel bag and drew out my heavy encrypted laptop. I opened the lid. Blue light swept sharp shadows up the room's peeling wallpaper. These hands of mine, roughened by 30-odd years of gripping contractors' handshakes, putting pen to multi-million-dollar land deals and crossing the concrete floors of sprawling Texas warehouses, were perfectly still. I pulled up my private secure terminal, then reached for my phone and called the 24-hour wealth management line at my private bank. When your liquid holdings run as deep as mine, somebody picks up before the second ring. A calm, measured voice greeted me. "Mr. Merritt, good evening. How can we assist you tonight?" I drew a slow breath and steadied myself. "I need to initiate a level 4 total asset freeze on the primary corporate portfolio and all associated subsidiary accounts." My voice came out flat, cold, and just slightly hollow in that empty room. The representative went quiet for half a heartbeat. On his end, I could make out the soft tap of keys. He was staring at 8-figure sums lighting up his screen. "Sir, I just need to verify your security protocols for a freeze of this magnitude. This will suspend all outgoing wires, disable all corporate credit lines, and lock the escrow accounts. Are you certain you wish to proceed?" "I am certain." I walked him through the alphanumeric passcodes. I cleared each layer of security questions one by one. I pushed the biometric confirmation through the encrypted app. Under 3 minutes, that's all it took to sever the financial lifeblood of a 30-year empire. Every corporate platinum card riding in Colin's wallet, every cash account he imagined he controlled, every credit line bearing the Merritt name frozen solid. Nothing could move. Not $1 without my physical presence, my voice print, and my signature. Colin had fired off that vicious little text, believing he was finally free of me, clear to pocket the millions he thought he'd already taken. Welcome back to Grandpa's Revenge, the place where quiet strength wins in the end. Before we go any further, I'd love to hear from you. Drop a comment and tell me, have you ever had someone you completely trusted turn on you? Just yes or no is enough. I read every single one. Now, a quick note, some elements of this story have been fictionalized for storytelling purposes, and any resemblance to specific real people or events is entirely coincidental. What matters most is the truth at the heart of it. While he was probably uncorking expensive bottles in my own living room, toasting his supposed triumph alongside Renee, I was sitting in a budget hotel room, quietly dismantling everything he thought he owned. I eased the laptop shut with a soft click and leaned back against the stiff hotel chair. For the first time since morning, something close to a grim smile crossed my face. I poured myself a paper cup of cold water from the bathroom tap, letting it soothe my dry, tight throat. I had come through a mild stroke just a few weeks before. The specialist told me to keep well away from stress. Rest, they said. Let your family look after you. Colin was supposed to be steering the company with integrity while I healed. Instead, he turned my medical crisis into a window of opportunity, forging legal documents, bribing a crooked doctor, and maneuvering to have me warehoused in assisted living. He wanted me gone so desperately that he changed the locks on the custom-built estate I had paid for in cash 40 years ago. But this was no longer about rest. This was about raw survival. This was about shielding my legacy from a man who happened to carry my name. I glanced at my phone lying silent on the nightstand. Quiet for now, but I knew exactly what was bearing down on us. The trap was set. The accounts were sealed. The poison pill I had buried inside the company's operating agreement years ago sat fully armed, waiting for its moment. Let me take you back to just 72 hours before this moment. 72 hours before I found myself in that dim hotel room, cutting off the financial oxygen to everything I had built. 72 hours before the illusion of a perfect family collapsed into sharp, jagged wreckage. because by the time the sun climbed the next morning, my phone screen would be blazing again, not with a cold dismissal, but with 43 frantic missed calls from a son who had just discovered he'd walked himself into a trap. By that point, it would already be far too late. The first thin light of dawn slipped through the gap in the hotel curtains and stretched a pale stripe across the foot of the bed. I hadn't closed my eyes once. Every time I tried, that text message played on repeat behind my eyelids. My body was exhausted, but something inside my mind was running cleaner and colder than it had in years. At exactly 6:00 in the morning, the stillness of that room cracked open with a hard, insistent buzzing. I turned my head slowly toward the nightstand. The phone screen blazed, flashing a name I had once said with nothing but pride. Colin. I watched it rattle against the surface, walking itself toward the edge. I didn't reach for it. I just sat there and let it ring itself out. It stopped, then picked back up 3 seconds later, then again and again. I finally reached over, unlocked the screen, and looked at the notification. 43 missed calls. 43 desperate attempts to reach the man he had thrown out of his life the night before. I could picture him clearly standing at some airport counter, face pale, platinum card declined, the full weight of what he'd done finally crushing down on those arrogant shoulders. He was cornered. The empire he believed he had taken was nothing more than a locked vault, and I held the only key. I swiped the notification away and put the phone back down. I wasn't ready to give him a single word yet. Let him sweat. Let him wear a hole in that terminal floor. Let him feel even a sliver of the helplessness he'd tried to press down on me just hours before. Now, to truly understand the brazen nerve behind those 43 missed calls, you need to know where this whole nightmare started. Take yourself back 72 hours back to when I still believed I had a son who loved me. 3 days earlier, the world felt completely different. I was perched on the edge of a freshly made bed inside an upscale rehabilitation clinic in North Houston. The room carried that particular blend of sterile alcohol wipes and faint lavender spray. 2 weeks before, a sudden tightness across my chest and a dead numbness in my left arm had landed me in the ER. A mild stroke, the doctors concluded, my body sending up a flare after 50 years of driving myself without mercy. But my recovery moved faster than anyone expected. My speech was clean. My motor function was fully restored. The physical therapist kept shaking her head, saying my sheer stubbornness was probably doing more work than any treatment. That morning, my primary care physician came through the door wearing a broad, easy smile and holding a signed clipboard. Final neurological tests had come back strong. I was cleared to go home 2 full days ahead of schedule. The relief that hit me was overwhelming. I wanted my own bed, my leather chair, and the view of the gardens my late wife and I had tended together. I decided against calling Colin or Renee to collect me. They'd been making the rounds at the clinic, performing deep concern, hauling in elaborate fruit baskets, speaking at length about how well they were minding things at the company so I could focus on healing. I wanted to walk in unannounced. I wanted to come through my own front door under my own power and show them the old man was back on his feet and ready to take the reins back. I packed my scuffed canvas duffel bag, signed the discharge papers, and stepped out through the clinic's glass doors into the warm Texas sunshine. I called a premium ride service. When the black SUV arrived, I settled into the back seat with something that felt almost like purpose returning to me. As we rolled down the highway toward my estate, I gazed out the tinted glass at the broad Houston skyline. I took in the towers of steel and glass, the massive commercial distribution centers spread across the horizon. I had helped shape a real portion of what I was looking at. I'd started with absolutely nothing, grinding through 100-hour weeks, trading sleep and comfort for a real estate portfolio that handed my family a life of genuine privilege. I gave Colin everything I had never been given. Private schooling, luxury vehicles, a guaranteed executive chair at my firm the day he walked off a graduation stage. I believed I was being a good father by clearing every obstacle from his path. What I failed to see was that by removing every hardship, I had produced a man with no understanding of what a dollar costs or what loyalty means. The SUV turned off the main road and onto the shaded residential street leading home. Broad oaks threw long, easy shadows across the trimmed lawns on either side. We pulled up to the wrought iron gates of my property. The house sat well back from the road, a handsome, sprawling custom stone mansion that stood for a lifetime of work and sacrifice. I thanked the driver, lifted my bag from the trunk, tipped him well, and stepped out onto the wide cobblestone drive. The morning air was cool and clean, carrying the scent of the sprawling live oak I had planted decades ago. I walked steadily toward the heavy front door and reached into my pocket for my keys. I was smiling, genuinely looking forward to the expression on my son's face. I had no idea I was walking straight into a calculated ambush. I pressed my familiar brass key into the heavy oak door. The mechanism that had turned for me thousands of times felt wrong, stiff in a way it had never been. I worked it back and forth, telling myself the humidity had swollen the wood, but it wouldn't catch. I withdrew the key, wiped it clean on my slacks, and tried once more. Nothing. A cold, heavy knot settled in my stomach. This was the home where I had raised my family. I knew every sound this house made, every groove in every frame. The lock had not stuck. It had been replaced entirely. I knocked firmly on the thick wood, the sound carrying out into the quiet morning. I expected my housekeeper's quick footsteps. Instead, I heard the deliberate, heavy stride of a man. The deadbolt turned. The door swung open, and there stood my son, Colin, dressed in a crisp, expensive designer suit, one I had very likely paid for, holding a mug of cold brew. No surprise registered on his face. No smile either. He simply filled the door frame, his broad shoulders forming a deliberate wall between me and my own home. Before I could get a word out, Renee materialized at his side. She had on her spotless athleisure set, projecting the image of the polished, wealthy housewife she'd spent years perfecting. No embrace. Instead, she tilted her head and offered me that particular smile, honeyed, condescending, the kind you'd aim at a child who doesn't understand what's happening around him. She asked what I was doing there, her voice soaked in counterfeit worry. She pointed out that I wasn't due to be released until Friday. I looked past both of them, trying to get eyes on my own foyer. I asked what had happened to my housekeeper, keeping my voice level but letting the edge show. I wanted to know why my own key wouldn't open my own door. I told Colin to move, that I was tired and wanted to sit down in my living room. I didn't budge a single inch. He raised the mug slowly, took a long sip, and trained on me a look I had never once seen from him before. Pure contempt, uncut and undisguised. He told me plainly that I wasn't coming in. Not a trace of warmth, not a flicker of hesitation. I felt my blood pressure climbing, my mind working hard to comprehend the sheer audacity of what I was hearing. I reminded him that I had built this house, that I had paid for the very ground beneath his feet, and I told him to get out of my way. Renee placed a measured hand on his forearm and stepped slightly forward to deliver the real blow. She told me not to work myself up, that it wasn't good for my heart. They'd been planning to tell me tomorrow, she said. With an unnerving calm, she explained that they had moved my belongings to a premium assisted living community on the outskirts of the city. Round-the-clock professional staff, she said. Beautiful grounds. People my own age. They had secured the finest suite available. Then she looked me straight in the eyes and said that after the stroke I needed proper care, now that it was time for me to step back and let Colin carry the weight of the business. I stood there absorbing her words like a man walking into ice water. Assisted living. I was a 75-year-old man who ran a multi-million-dollar commercial real estate firm. I had walked out of that rehabilitation clinic that very morning with a clean bill of health. My mind was sharp enough to untangle complex zoning disputes and negotiate corporate mergers. I didn't need anyone to look after me. I needed my son to step aside. I lowered my voice to something quiet and dangerous and told them this was not open for discussion. I made it plain they did not get to box up my life and ship me off to a retirement home without my say-so. I told them to clear the doorway or I would call the police and have them both removed from my property for trespassing. Colin let out a short, hollow laugh, a sound that moved through me like something cold. His hand went into the breast pocket of his tailored jacket and came out with a neatly folded set of thick legal documents. He snapped them open with a flick of his wrist and held them up in the morning light just far enough that I couldn't grab them. He told me not to bother calling the police. His manner shifted, the dismissiveness dropping away into something openly hostile. He stated it flatly. If law enforcement showed up, they wouldn't be taking him or Renee anywhere. They'd be escorting me straight to a psychiatric ward. My eyes moved across the heavy text at the top of the page. Power of attorney. Clipped behind it, attached with a brass staple, was a medical certificate carrying the letterhead of the hospital I had just spent 2 weeks in. I leaned in and read the bolded summary of my supposed diagnosis. Advanced cognitive decline. Dementia. The signature at the bottom was from a neurologist I had met exactly once on my first night in the intensive care unit. The ground seemed to shift under me. I demanded to know what I was looking at, my hands pulling into fists. I told them it was a fabrication, every word of it. My own physician had cleared me less than an hour ago, a mild cardiac event, not dementia. Renee sighed heavily, shaking her head in that theatrical way of hers. She said to Colin that I was confused again. The doctors had warned them about these episodes. She claimed the agitation, the gaps in memory. I told her sharply to stop speaking to me like I was something to be managed. I knew my own mind, and I had never, not once, signed over power of attorney granting them authority over my life or my assets. Colin moved closer to the threshold, using his height to press down on me. He leaned in and said quietly that I had a cruel curl at the corner of his mouth. 3 days ago, he said, with a notary present. My thoughts lurched backward, clawing through the fog of recent days. A Tuesday afternoon surfaced in my memory. The pain medication had hit particularly hard that day, leaving me slow and disoriented. Colin had walked into my hospital room with a stack of clipboards, routine insurance authorization forms he'd told me, paperwork the clinic required to keep my private suite covered. He had guided my hand to the signature lines, telling me he was just handling the administrative details so I could get some rest. He had used my trust, my complete vulnerability, to take everything from me. The full weight of it landed on my chest all at once. I looked at the man I had raised, the son I had handed every conceivable advantage, and I told him what he had done, that he had sat beside my hospital bed, held my hand, and robbed me senseless while I was sedated. Colin shot back that he was simply protecting the family's assets from a man who was clearly past his peak. His eyes went hard and flat with greed. He accused me of planning to work until I collapsed and dragged the company down with me. He called what he'd done an acceleration of the inevitable. He told me the papers were ironclad. The doctor had testified that my stroke had seriously compromised my judgment. The notary had witnessed the signature. He controlled the firm, the bank accounts, and the house. Then he delivered his closing threat. If I set 1 foot across that threshold, he would call emergency services on the spot. He would tell them his father, a dementia patient, had wandered away from his care facility and was turning violent. They would put me on a psychiatric hold in a state-run facility, he promised, and I would never breathe open air again. I stood there on the cobblestone driveway, the Texas sun pressing warm on my back, feeling colder than I ever had. I was looking into the eyes of something I had built with my own hands. He had set this up with precision. The medical documents, the legal authority, physical control of my own home. He had every piece in position. If I erupted, if I raised my voice or threw a punch, I'd be handing them exactly what they needed. I'd look precisely like the unhinged, confused old man their paperwork described. Behind him, Renee stood with her arms folded, her face a composed mask of satisfaction. The silence between us stretched taut. A weaker man might have crumbled on that driveway. A weaker man might have gone to his knees and pleaded with his own blood for a small corner of his own home to grow old in. But as I held Colin's smug gaze, the shock began to drain away, and something altogether different moved in to fill the space. A cold, crystalline clarity settled over me. He believed a handful of forged signatures and a paid-off doctor were sufficient to bring down a man who had fought and won cutthroat corporate battles for 40 years. He had the documents. What he lacked was the depth to grasp what he was truly up against. I did not scream. I didn't swing. I refused to hand either of them so much as a crumb of the reaction they were hungry for. Instead, I drew one slow, deliberate breath and let it steady my heart. I adjusted the strap of my scuffed canvas duffel bag and looked my son directly in the eyes. I caught the faint flicker of doubt moving behind his confidence. He had braced for a fight. He had expected me to fall apart. My stillness unsettled him. I turned my back on them without another word. I walked away from that heavy front door, down the wide cobblestone path, and out through the wrought iron gates of my own estate. I could feel their eyes on my back the whole way, but I never once looked over my shoulder. I pulled out my phone, called another car, and directed it to the nearest business hotel. They thought they were watching a defeated man retreat. They assumed they had cleanly exiled me to a quiet, diminished existence in some care facility. But as I rode in the back of that car and watched my neighborhood recede in the rear window, my grief was already reshaping itself into something far more useful. They had no idea that their tidy little scheme was merely the opening move in a game they were never going to win. The black town car moved smoothly through the streets I'd driven 1,000 times, carrying me away from the only home I had known for 4 decades. I sat watching the manicured lawns slide past the tinted glass. I knew precisely what was unfolding back at the estate. Colin and Renee were probably standing in my grand foyer at that very moment, helping themselves to the aged single malt scotch I had been keeping in the study and raising their crystal glasses in a victory toast. My silence on that driveway had read to them as total capitulation, proof that I was too broken, too ill, too tired to mount any real resistance against their airtight legal coup. It is a dangerous thing to underestimate a man who has nothing left to lose but his pride. Their arrogance was their biggest blind spot. They assumed I operated the way they did through loud ultimatums and messy confrontations. But my entire career had been built in the shadows, reading opponents 3 moves ahead and never striking until the advantage was squarely mine. You don't raise a commercial real estate empire by making scenes on your own front porch. You build it by mastering the quiet, deliberate strike. I brought out my phone and told the driver to take me to a specific hotel downtown, one of the business properties where the corporate suites ran high-speed encrypted internet connections. 20 minutes later, I was at the front desk. The clerk handed me a key card with a pleasant smile, having no way of knowing that the older gentleman standing before him had just been driven out of his own home by his own son. I rode the elevator up to the 11th floor and followed the quiet carpeted corridor to my room. When I let myself in, the space offered nothing in the way of comfort. Standard corporate suite, muted grays and beiges, a heavy wooden desk positioned before a wide window looking out over the Houston skyline stretching below. A far cry from the custom oak paneling and worn leather of my home office, but it would serve its purpose exactly. This was no longer a place to recover. This room was about to become my command center. I dropped my scuffed canvas duffel bag onto the edge of the bed and went straight to the desk. I didn't unpack a single shirt. I didn't switch on the television. I didn't even pull off my suit jacket. Whatever physical fatigue had trailed me out of that clinic had burned away entirely, replaced by a cold, focused energy running hard through my veins. The grief of watching my son choose greed over blood sat like a stone in my chest, but I pressed it down and buried it under something harder. There would be time to mourn what this family had become. Right now I had an empire to defend. I unzipped the side compartment of my bag and drew out my laptop, a heavy military-grade machine custom-built to my exact security specifications. I plugged it in and pressed the power button. The screen came alive with a hard blue glow washing across my face. I connected to the secure network and brought up the main login portal for Merit Commercial Real Estate and Logistics. The company logo, a warehouse crane I had sketched on a notepad 30 years ago, appeared to greet me. I entered my executive credentials. The screen held for a moment, then blazed a bright red error message. Access denied. Account suspended. I let out a dry, quiet laugh that had nothing of humor in it. Colin had moved fast. The moment that forged power of attorney was pushed through, he must have given the IT department their orders: lock the former owner out of his own front-end systems. He probably sat back feeling very clever, believing he'd severed my connection to the company's nervous system entirely. But Colin was a vice president who had inherited his title without earning it. He understood how to run the machinery. He had never learned how it was built. What he didn't know was that 10 years earlier, when we overhauled our entire digital infrastructure, I had personally sat with our lead network architect and quietly ordered the creation of a ghost protocol, an invisible, untraceable backdoor buried deep inside the server architecture designed specifically for a catastrophic emergency. An emergency exactly like a hostile takeover from within. I closed the main portal and opened a blank command terminal. The screen went solid black, cursor blinking, waiting. I cracked my knuckles in the still hotel room and began typing. Line after line of code spilled across the screen, threading past the standard firewalls and through the security layers Colin believed were sealed against me. The terminal called for secondary biometric verification. I pressed my thumb to the keyboard scanner. A green light answered. The system confirmed my identity, and just like that, the walls came down. The black screen dissolved, replaced by the raw master dashboard of my entire corporate network. Every bank account, every active real estate contract, every internal communication thread, every last cent of liquid capital, all of it spread out before me in real time. I was inside. Colin had changed the lock on the front door, but he had completely forgotten to check the basement. The company's digital footprint was enormous, but I knew exactly where to look. I went straight to the executive transaction logs and filtered for activity across the past 14 days, the full length of my hospital stay. I needed to see with my own eyes what my son had been doing while I lay in that bed fighting to come back. The cursor blinked steadily while the server worked through my request. The search for the truth had begun. The data appeared in clean, glowing rows. To anyone else, it would have looked like an unremarkable corporate spreadsheet. To me, these numbers were the vital signs of everything I had built. I could read the rhythm of my company the way a doctor reads a pulse, the flow of capital, the timing of payroll runs the cadence of operational expenses. I leaned toward the screen, its harsh light catching in my eyes, and began working through the transaction logs from the precise moment my ambulance had pulled away from the corporate offices 2 weeks before. I expected to find incompetence. Bloated expense accounts, maybe a needless company car, an inflated executive bonus Colin had written himself the moment my back was turned. I had braced for greed. I was not prepared for what was actually on that screen. I opened the primary operating ledger, the account we used for daily contractor payments and property maintenance. The balance was shockingly low. I frowned and highlighted a cluster of transactions dated just 3 days after my stroke. A wire transfer for $50,000. The recipient was a vendor name I had never seen, a generic entity with no prior history anywhere in our system. I pulled up the attached digital invoice, a crude, vaguely worded claim for consulting services. My jaw went tight. Colin hadn't even bothered to make it look convincing. 2 days after that, another transfer, $75,000, routed to a different unknown account. Then $100,000, then another $100,000. The withdrawals came in almost every other day, bleeding the operating account out with complete disregard. I opened the master calculator and began feeding in the figures. My keystrokes echoed off the walls of that silent room, a steady drumbeat marking the scale of the betrayal taking shape on the screen. $50,000 added to $75,000, then $100,000, then another $120,000. The running total climbed steadily, each entry a new measure of what my son had done. When I finally hit enter on the last transaction logged the previous afternoon, the final figure sat there on the screen, cold and absolute. Over $500,000 in liquid cash had disappeared from the corporate accounts in 14 days. $500,000 simply gone. I leaned back in the stiff hotel chair and pressed my palms against my tired eyes. A cold sweat gathered at the back of my neck. This was not a spoiled heir padding his lifestyle with luxury watches or throwing money at extravagant parties. You don't bleed $500,000 through untraceable wire transfers across 2 weeks just to fund a lavish lifestyle. This was frantic and uncoordinated, a desperate scramble. The erratic spacing between transfers, the slipshod fake invoices, the sheer volume of cash moving at that pace, it all assembled into a specific and terrifying picture. Colin wasn't simply greedy. Colin was absolutely terrified. I leaned forward again, my mind tearing through the possibilities. In high-stakes commercial real estate, $500,000 in liquid cash is a serious sum. But it is not retirement money. It is not enough to walk away from a multi-million-dollar company, which meant this stolen cash wasn't a nest egg. It was a bandage. Colin was trying to plug a massive and actively bleeding hole somewhere else. He was feeding corporate cash into a fire, buying himself time. But time against what? Who was receiving these payments? And why was the desperation so nakedly visible in his digital trail? The gut feeling that had been pressing at the edges of my mind since I stood on that driveway crystallized into something sharp and undeniable. Forcing me out of my own home and ramming through that fraudulent power of attorney was not the endgame. It was the prerequisite. Colin hadn't locked me out because he wanted to occupy my chair and run the business. He had locked me out because he was in immediate desperate trouble, and he needed unrestricted access to the company's deepest reserves to save himself. Hun needed me declared mentally incompetent, so I couldn't step in and close the wound before he finished whatever catastrophic maneuver he was caught up in. I stared at the blinking cursor, a deep sorrow threading itself through the cold anger. My son was not merely a thief. He was a drowning man using my life's work as a flotation device, fully prepared to push me under to keep his own head above water. The $500,000 was just the opening act. It was the frantic thrashing of someone who already knew he was sinking. If he was this far gone, he wouldn't stop at the operating cash. He'd go after the hard assets. He'd go after the foundational pillars holding the entire enterprise together. I closed the ledger and pulled up the master asset portfolio. This was the vault, the property deeds, the long-term investments, the multi-million-dollar holdings. My hands were slightly unsteady as I worked through the digital security gates. If Colin had reached this level, the damage could be genuinely irreversible. I set a filter to surface any pending contracts, active listings, or fresh appraisals initiated within the past 2 weeks. The server ground through the data for a few seconds. The loading icons spun on screen, each second stretching longer than it should. I held my breath, willing my instincts to be wrong, hoping the destruction was contained to the liquid reserves. But when the screen refreshed and the new data spread across the dashboard, the blood left my face entirely. The $500,000 was barely a footnote compared to what I was looking at now. I clicked on the master folder marked Pending Acquisitions and Liquidations. The system paused for just a fraction of a second, as if reluctant to reveal the full scale of the damage. When the page opened, my eyes went straight to 2 specific addresses sitting at the very top of the screen, flagged in aggressive yellow priority fast-track processing. The air went out of me. These were not run-down strip malls or aging office parks. These were the twin East Houston distribution centers, the absolute crown jewels of my entire commercial real estate portfolio. I had bought that land 30 years ago when the area was nothing but dirt and scrub brush. I had personally overseen the pouring of every square foot of concrete. I had negotiated the long-term leases with multinational logistics firms, locking in revenue streams that had kept my company completely bulletproof through 3 separate economic recessions. Massive state-of-the-art facilities spanning hundreds of thousands of square feet, the beating heart of everything I had built, and my son was putting them up for sale. My hands were visibly trembling as I opened the attached contracts. I needed to see the terms. I needed to know the buyer and, more critically, the price. Under normal market conditions, those 2 properties together would appraise comfortably at $25 million. In today's aggressive industrial real estate climate, a patient seller could pull $28, even $30 million without straining. But as my eyes moved down to the final agreed purchase price, my vision went blurry with a combination of raw fury and pure bewilderment. $15 million. I blinked and pressed closer to the monitor until I could almost count the pixels. $15 million. Colin was liquidating the cornerstone of this company at barely 60% of its true market value. It was a financial slaughter. No rational businessman, regardless of how green, would ever sign off on a deal that left 10 to 15 million sitting uncollected on the table. It violated every basic principle of commercial real estate. I traced the timeline of the transaction following the chain of digital signatures and notary stamps. The speed of it was staggering. A commercial deal of this size normally demands months of due diligence, environmental studies, structural inspections, layers of legal negotiation. Colin had bulldozed the entire process in just 12 days. He had waived the inspection periods. He had bypassed our standard internal legal review entirely. I was treating the crown jewels of a 30-year empire like stolen goods being offloaded for quick cash in a back alley. The closing date was set for this coming Monday. The funds were scheduled to land in our corporate escrow account in under 48 hours. He was sprinting toward the finish line at a catastrophic discount, burning the very foundation of his own inheritance just to get $15 million into his hands as fast as possible. I pushed back from the desk and stood up the hotel room, suddenly feeling far too small to contain what I was feeling. I moved the short distance between the bed and the window, staring out at the city lights scattered across the dark below. The cold logic of it began to assemble itself in my mind. Why would an ambitious, acquisitive young man willingly torch his own future wealth? The answer was brutally simple. He was no longer thinking about the future. I was fighting to survive the present. You don't accept a 60% haircut on prime real estate unless your back is so hard against the wall that something is breaking. Colin had not seized control of my company because he wanted to play the powerful executive. He was in immediate life-threatening financial danger. He had dug himself into a hole so deep and so dark that the only way out was to blow up my life's work and use the debris to climb free. He needed an 8-figure sum of cash by Monday morning, and he was prepared to commit elder abuse, falsify medical documents, and perpetrate fraud to secure it. I stopped pacing and pressed my forehead against the cold glass of the window. The betrayal bit deeper now. It wasn't only about the money. It was about his total contempt for the legacy I had spent my life constructing for him. He was treating decades of my blood and sacrifice as nothing more than a resource to burn through, covering his own catastrophic failures. He believed I was tucked away in some sterile care facility, heavily medicated, and blissfully unaware that he was selling my life's work to the lowest bidder. He thought he had outmaneuvered the old man, but he had left a digital trail a mile wide, and he had badly misjudged my will to fight. I walked back to the desk and looked at the glowing screen. The $15 million transaction sat there pending, waiting for Monday. I could have locked the escrow account right then. I could have called the bank and halted the wire, but that would only treat the symptom. It would leave the disease untouched. I needed to know exactly who was purchasing these warehouses and precisely what Colin owed $15 million to cover. I could not move on this alone. I needed someone on the outside, someone who read the legal landscape the way I read the real estate market. I needed a predator. I reached into my bag, set aside my primary phone, and came out with a cheap prepaid burner I had always kept ready for exactly this kind of emergency. It was time to call in the wolf, to finally drag into the open every lie my son had carefully constructed to dismantle my life before Monday morning arrived and took the decision out of my hands entirely. I worked the small plastic keys on the burner, dialing a number I had held in memory for over 40 years. It rang twice before a gravelly voice answered. Leonard Stratton did not believe in pleasantries. He was a 70-year-old corporate attorney who had navigated the bloodiest mergers and acquisitions in Texas history. We'd first crossed paths in our late 20s, two hungry men clawing out their own corners of the world. He was the one person I trusted without reservation. My life, my money, my darkest secrets. So I laid it out plainly. Colin had changed the locks on me, forged a medical power of attorney, and was actively dumping the East Houston distribution centers at 60 cents on the dollar. The line went dead for a full 5 seconds. I could make out the faint blur of traffic noise somewhere behind him. Then Leonard asked me where exactly I was. I gave him the downtown Houston hotel address and my room number. He told me to get some coffee going and ended the call. Fewer than 45 minutes later, a hard knock cut through the silence of my hotel room. I pulled open the door to find Leonard standing in the hallway. He had on a navy suit and was carrying a massive leather briefcase. The silver in his hair didn't soften him one bit. The man still had the commanding, unmistakable presence of a silverback. He stepped in, sharp eyes sweeping the sterile room and the laptop glowing on the small desk. He didn't offer pity. He didn't ask how I was holding up after the stroke or how my heart was taking the betrayal. Leonard Stratton understood that sympathy was a wasted weapon in wartime. Instead, he heaved the briefcase onto the mattress, flipped the brass latches, and started pulling out thick legal pads, encrypted drives, and a portable scanner. We dragged the desk to the middle of the room and turned it into a command post. I called down for black coffee and we got to work. The gap between the reality I was living and the story my son had spun for everyone else was almost funny. Colin and his wife Renee were probably back at my estate right now hosting guests, enjoying the warm evening air, fully convinced I was parked in some grim assisted living ward under heavy sedation. They thought the old man was finished. What they couldn't know was that their little move had just shaken awake two of the most ruthless operators in Houston commercial real estate. We weren't resting. We were loading our weapons one round at a time, getting ready to flatten the whole arrogant fiction my son had constructed. Leonard pulled up a chair, slotted his encrypted drive into my laptop, and piggybacked off the ghost protocol. As a former federal prosecutor, Leonard had a genuinely frightening gift for reading the intent buried beneath financial documents. He didn't just look at the numbers, he looked at what the numbers were trying to hide. While I'd been fixated on the pending warehouse sale, Leonard launched into a rapid forensic audit of Colin's entire digital footprint over the past year. He pulled personal expense reports, cross-referenced them against corporate credit lines, and began mapping the precise arc of my son's desperation. The hotel room grew close and warm, thick with the smell of roasted coffee and the quiet, relentless hum of the laptop fan. We worked in perfect sync, a silent rhythm built between two old men who'd fought 100 battles side by side. I would surface the internal routing numbers and Leonard would run them through the external banking networks. For 3 straight hours, the only sounds were keyboards clattering, papers shuffling, and the occasional sharp exhale from Leonard each time another piece of the picture clicked into place. I was taking Colin's financial life apart with surgical patience. He started with the $500,000 in missing operating cash. Within 20 minutes, Leonard had completely dismantled the fabricated consulting invoices Colin had loaded into the system. By running the routing numbers through his proprietary legal database, Leonard confirmed that the shell companies receiving those transfers were no consulting firms. They were offshore holding accounts registered in the Cayman Islands, accounts known for their absolute opacity and their long history of sheltering illicit money from domestic authorities. Colin wasn't simply stealing. He was systematically laundering corporate funds across international borders. But Leonard didn't stop there. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his chin, eyes locked on the screen. He said that moving $500,000 offshore was a serious federal crime, but it still didn't account for the sheer panic behind selling the East Houston distribution centers for $15 million by Monday morning. The offshore transfers were a clumsy attempt to hide cash. The real estate liquidation was something else entirely, a desperate move to generate massive capital fast. Leonard pulled up the pending purchase agreement for the warehouses. He skipped straight past the financial terms and scrolled directly to the buyer's information. The purchasing entity was listed as a limited liability company incorporated in Delaware, a state famous for letting corporate owners stay completely invisible to the public. Most people would have hit a wall right there. But Leonard Stratton was not most people. He opened a hidden backdoor legal registry he used for corporate espionage work, bypassing public filings and drilling straight into the registered agent records. I watched his face while the data came up on screen. That grim, focused expression he'd been wearing for the past 3 hours dissolved, replaced by something I almost didn't recognize: genuine shock. He slowly turned to face me and took off his reading glasses. He said my name in a whisper, his voice carrying an edge I had never once heard from him. He told me I needed to look at the screen. He'd found the registered agent for the shell company. The pieces snapped into place, and the picture they formed was so grotesque, so twisted, that it knocked the air clean out of me. I leaned over the makeshift desk and traced my eyes along the lines of data Leonard had highlighted on his encrypted display. The room was absolutely still, broken only by the low hum of the laptop and the distant wail of a police siren drifting up from the Houston streets below. My heart beat a slow, heavy count against my ribs as I read the name listed under the registered agent for the Delaware LLC. It wasn't a faceless corporate entity. It wasn't some rival developer moving in for a predatory bargain. The name staring back at me in plain white letters was Bryce Canfield. I blinked, a sudden chill moving across my skin. Bryce Canfield was no titan of industry. He was a 28-year-old failed graphic designer who spent most of his time hitting up his sister for loans to float one doomed startup after another. His sister was Renee, my daughter-in-law, the same woman who had stood on my front porch just hours ago in her spotless athleisure set and a mask of counterfeit concern, telling me I needed to be put away in a facility. Leonard let out a low, humorless sound, less a laugh than gravel dragged across stone. He leaned back and folded his arms across his broad chest. Then he laid out the entire scheme with the cold, clinical detachment of a seasoned prosecutor walking a jury through a murder. They were not selling the East Houston distribution centers to a third party to raise cash. They were selling the crown jewels of my empire directly to themselves. It was a textbook shell game engineered to strip the most valuable assets from the corporate portfolio and park them safely behind an anonymous corporate veil controlled entirely by Renee and her family. I stared at the screen, my mind struggling to absorb the sheer audacity of the fraud. Leonard walked me through the mechanics step by step. They had set up the Delaware Shell Company exactly 3 weeks ago, right around the time I first started complaining about chest pains. The timing was not remotely a coincidence. It was a calculated, deeply malicious contingency, and by pegging the purchase price at a steeply discounted $15 million, they were manufacturing a catastrophic financial loss inside my own company. But the true evil genius of the plan was buried in the financing mechanics. Leonard pulled up another hidden document, a loan origination file tied to Bryce's Shell Company. They had secured a $15 million private equity loan to fund the purchase using the warehouses themselves as the primary collateral. They were using my own buildings to guarantee the money they planned to use to buy them from me. Once the transaction closed Monday morning, the $15 million would be wired into our corporate escrow account, and under the forged power of attorney, Colin would have immediate, unrestricted, unchallenged access to every last penny. Leonard jabbed a thick, calloused finger at the screen and laid out the endgame. Colin and Renee would wire that $15 million straight out of the corporate account and into their untraceable offshore holdings in the Cayman Islands. They would disappear with the liquid cash, leaving my company hollowed out and hemorrhaging. Meanwhile, Renee's brother would be sitting on $25 million worth of prime commercial real estate in East Houston. Even with the $15 million loan attached, they had conjured $10 million in pure laundered equity for themselves out of nothing. It was an absolute masterpiece of corporate theft. The full weight of what I was looking at hit me like a fist driven straight into my chest. Before I go any further, I want to stop here for just a moment, because what I was about to learn about the people sitting at my own dinner table would shake me to my core. So let me ask you this: if you suspected someone close to you was quietly working against everything you built, would you confront them immediately, or would you wait and gather every piece of proof first? This was not some panicked, cornered move from a son who'd stumbled in over his head. This was a sophisticated, coldly premeditated criminal conspiracy. Colin and Renee had sat at my dining room table for Sunday dinners, smiling, asking me to pass the wine, while quietly building an elaborate financial guillotine designed to separate me from everything I'd spent my life creating. Renee had pulled her own brother into it, turning the systematic destruction of my legacy into a twisted family joint venture. I thought about how many times I had gone to bat for both of them. I remembered clearing Renee's enormous credit card debts the moment they got married without breathing a word about it to anyone. I remembered hiring the finest contractors in the state to build their custom home, the very house they were celebrating in right now. I had treated her as my own, and in return she had engineered a hostile takeover of my entire existence, using her own sibling as a proxy to pull the trigger. The deep sorrow that had been sitting on my chest began to lift, burned away, replaced by a cold, crystallized fury. The betrayal was so total, so thoroughly rotten, that it cut loose whatever threads of feeling I still had for the boy I'd raised. Colin was no longer my son. He was a hostile threat. Renee was not family. She was a parasite. And I was about to remind both of them exactly who had built the empire they were scrambling to steal. I turned back to Leonard. The attorney was watching me with a quiet, steady understanding. He knew the full weight of what I was sitting with. I asked him the only question that still mattered. I asked if we had enough solid evidence to stop the transfer before Monday morning. Leonard shook his head slowly. He explained that blocking the wire would only set off a drawn-out legal war. Colin still held the forged power of attorney. If we moved to stop the sale now, he would panic and run. We had to let the trap close all the way. We had to let them win today. We had to let them win today. I stared at Leonard, trying to absorb the full gravity of what he was saying. Letting them win meant watching $15 million of everything I'd built slide straight into the hands of my treacherous son and his manipulative wife. It cut against every instinct I'd sharpened over 40 years in the brutal world of commercial real estate. When you catch a thief with his hand in your pocket, you break his fingers. You don't stand back and wait for him to pull out the wallet. But Leonard raised a hand, pressing me to stay calm. He laid it out clearly: if we moved too soon, if we simply blocked the escrow transfer and confronted Colin with the Shell Company records, we'd only be holding evidence of an attempted corporate manipulation. Colin could frame it as an aggressive but legitimate restructuring play. He could throw expensive lawyers at it, bury the company in years of litigation, and drag my name through the mud while I bled out in civil court. Leonard leaned in closer, his eyes narrowing into cold, calculating slits. He told me that to put Colin away for good, to make sure he faced a federal prison cell instead of a civil settlement, the wire transfer had to actually go through. Federal wire fraud only becomes a fully committed crime when money physically crosses state lines under false pretenses. But that still left the most critical question hanging in the air. Why was Colin doing this right now? Why rush a massive real estate liquidation at a 60% discount, courting exposure and total ruin just to move $15 million? He already had a multi-million-dollar trust fund. He drew a six-figure salary. He lived in a house I built for him. The pieces were all on the table, but something at the center of the picture was still hidden in the dark. Leonard swung back to his encrypted laptop, fingers moving across the keys with renewed sharpness. He said a man only torches his own castle when something far worse is already closing in on the walls. He began working backward through the digital trail from the offshore Cayman accounts, hunting for the original spark that set this whole desperate fire burning. It took nearly 2 hours of burrowing through hidden servers and bypassing secondary firewalls before he found the source of the rot. When he finally surfaced the hidden ledger, the air in the room grew very still. Leonard turned the laptop screen toward me, his face completely unreadable. It was a digital statement from an unregulated offshore cryptocurrency exchange. I am an old-school real estate developer. I understand bricks, concrete, steel, and long-term leases. I never trusted digital currency, and I had made it strictly off-limits for my company to touch any speculative crypto positions. But my son, always certain he was the sharpest mind in any room, had ignored my directives entirely. Leonard pointed to a cluster of massive transactions executed 3 months prior. Colin had not simply bought cryptocurrency. He had ventured into something called high-risk margin trading. He had borrowed an enormous sum of money to place a heavily leveraged bet on a volatile digital asset, gambling on doubling his net worth in a single night. But to secure that kind of financing from an unregulated shadow syndicate, he had needed collateral. My blood went cold as I looked at the collateral documents attached to the digital loan. Colin had secretly pledged the corporate assets of Merit Commercial Real Estate and Logistics as the full backing for his personal gambling habit. He had forged my signature to guarantee the debt. Then the market collapsed. The digital asset cratered, triggering an immediate and catastrophic margin call. Colin was wiped out completely. The screen showed the final devastating balance. My son owed $12 million to a shadow syndicate of unregulated offshore lenders. These were not polite bankers who would talk through a restructured payment plan over drinks. These were dangerous, faceless entities that specialized in recovering what they were owed through any means available to them. All at once, the entire elaborate scheme snapped into a horrible, perfect clarity. The panic, the sudden push to have me declared mentally unfit, the fire sale of the East Houston warehouses to his brother-in-law. They didn't force me out of my own home to take over the company and carry on the legacy. They forced me out because the wolves were already at the gate. Colin needed $15 million by Monday morning to retire the $12 million debt and disappear with the remaining $3 million. He and Renee were planning to leave the country, slipping away to a non-extradition jurisdiction where they could live quietly on what remained of the stolen cash. But the true cruelty of the plan was the wreckage they intended to leave behind. By using my company to secure the debt and executing the fraudulent sale under my name, with that forged power of attorney, they were legally positioning me to absorb the entire fall. When the dust cleared and federal investigators started turning over rocks, they would find a gutted corporation, massive fraudulent transfers, and my forged signature across every document. Colin was prepared to leave his own father to face the federal government, furious creditors, and the complete destruction of our family name while he sat on a beach somewhere with a drink in his hand. He was going to let me die in a federal prison hospital just to outrun the consequences of his own catastrophic stupidity. I pushed back from the desk, my legs heavy as concrete. I crossed to the window and looked out over the city I had spent a lifetime helping to shape. The pain in my chest was sharp and real, but it was no longer grief. It was the hard, focused clarity of a man who understood he was fighting for his life. I turned back to Leonard and gave a slow nod. The silence stretched for a long moment, heavy with everything we had uncovered. Leonard shut his encrypted laptop with a firm, decisive snap. He looked at me, jaw set like stone. Then he reached into his pocket and produced his phone. He told me he was calling his best contacts at the Federal Bureau of Investigation right now. Between the forged medical documents and the offshore shell company records, we had enough circumstantial evidence to secure an emergency injunction and halt the Monday morning transaction. He said we needed to freeze the assets immediately and let federal prosecutors get ahead of the wreckage before Colin could trigger a full debt collapse on my company. I reached out and laid my hand firmly over his. I looked into the eyes of the man who had stood beside me in boardrooms for 40 years, and I shook my head slowly. "No," I said, my voice barely above a whisper but carrying a tone of absolute finality. "Do not make the call, not yet." Leonard's hand froze above his phone keypad, a frown creasing his face. He argued that we were playing an extraordinarily dangerous game. He reminded me that $15 million was set to land in our corporate escrow account the moment the bank opened Monday morning. He warned that if Colin managed to push through the outbound wire to the Cayman Islands before we could move against it, that money would be gone, permanently swallowed into a digital void beyond the reach of American law enforcement, while I was left holding every piece of the wreckage. I held firm, my grip on his hand steady. I understood the risks completely, but I also understood the law, and more importantly, I understood the deep, fundamental cowardice of my son. I explained to Leonard that calling the authorities tonight meant we were only interrupting an attempted transaction. Colin was clever enough to muddy the water. He could claim the warehouse sale was a sound business decision to generate capital during a perceived corporate crisis. He could argue the power of attorney was legitimate, that he executed it because he genuinely believed my health was in decline. A skilled defense attorney could reshape all of this into a tangled civil dispute between a father and son over the future of a family business. At best, Colin would walk away with a reprimand. At worst, he would drag my name through a decade of grinding public litigation. I moved back to the makeshift desk and stood over the dark laptop screen. I told Leonard I had no interest in a civil dispute, no interest in a messy family court battle. What I wanted was absolute, undeniable justice. And to get there, we had to let Colin and Renee walk past the point of no return. I laid out how the trap would work. The $15 million would reach the corporate escrow account Monday morning. That money technically belonged to the company, but the real crime, the airtight federal offense, would only crystallize at the moment Colin physically signed the final wire transfer authorization to move those funds from our domestic corporate account into his hidden offshore vehicle. The instant he signed that document and triggered the transfer under false pretenses, operating under a forged power of attorney, he would be committing textbook federal wire fraud. No gray area, no civil defense available to him. It would be a premeditated criminal act carrying a mandatory federal prison sentence. I wanted his signature in ink. I wanted his digital fingerprint embedded in the transfer protocol. I wanted the fraud executed so blatantly that no high-priced defense lawyer anywhere in the country could carve him a way out. I was prepared to put $15 million on the table to guarantee that the man who tried to dismantle my life would spend the next 20 years inside a federal penitentiary. Leonard studied me across the room, the harsh hotel lighting throwing deep shadows across his weathered face. He was a ruthless man by nature, but even he seemed taken aback by the sheer coldness of what I was proposing. He lowered his phone slowly and slid it back into his jacket pocket. He asked whether I was absolutely certain I wanted to take this gamble. He reminded me we were operating with almost no margin for error. If the banking system processed Colin's outbound wire before our countermeasures were in position, the empire I had built from nothing would be completely obliterated. I turned back to the window and looked out at the glittering Houston skyline. I had spent my life putting those lights up there. I was not about to let a parasite switch them off. I told Leonard I was certain I had come through poverty, economic collapse, and a stroke. I was not going to let a spoiled child and his manipulative wife beat me on my own board. We were going to sit in this hotel room, drink bad black coffee, and watch the clock count down to Monday morning. We were going to let Colin believe he had already won, let him savor it, let him start packing, let him walk right to the edge of the finish line, and then at the very last possible moment we were going to pull the floor out from under him. Leonard exhaled a long, heavy breath, a grim smile finally working its way across his face. He settled back at the desk, opened the laptop, and said we had a great deal of work ahead of us to arm the kill switch. I stood over his shoulder in silence, watching lines of code begin filling the screen. We had 48 hours until the banks opened. 48 hours before my son would unknowingly seal his own fate. The trap was set, and I was the one holding the lock. Leonard leaned back in his chair, pressing his fingers against his tired eyes, and finally surfaced the question that had been hanging between us. He asked how I intended to stop a digital transaction that processes in milliseconds. As far as the bank's automated systems were concerned, a forged power of attorney was a perfectly valid golden ticket. Leonard argued that human intervention would move far too slowly to intercept a wire of that size. He said we needed something immovable, a wall, not a speed bump. I felt a cold smile cross my face, one that felt unfamiliar. I told him the wall was already there, poured into the very foundation of the company itself. I asked Leonard whether he remembered the corporate restructuring we completed exactly a decade ago. He frowned, his memory sifting back through thousands of past legal engagements. I reminded him the year my wife died, the year I suddenly felt my own mortality bearing down and began paying close attention to the men Colin was surrounding himself with. I had watched too many wealthy families devour each other from the inside heirs, stripping apart carefully built empires the moment the man at the top was gone. I decided then that I would never allow my legacy to be carved up by an unworthy successor. so I directed our outside legal counsel in Washington to bury a highly classified contingency clause deep inside the company's master operating agreement. I called it the poison pill. Leonard's expression sharpened his mind, already reaching for the concept. A poison pill is a corporate finance mechanism used to repel hostile takeovers by making the target unappealing to the aggressor. I had adapted it for a personal threat. I walked Leonard through the precise mechanics of the clause. I had hardwired a rigid financial covenant directly into our primary federal banking charter. The rule was absolute with no exceptions carved out for anyone. If any executive board member or individual operating under a power of attorney attempted to liquidate corporate assets exceeding 30% of the company's total net worth within a single fiscal quarter, the system required a very specific secondary authorization. A signature, forged or otherwise, was completely insufficient. A standard notary stamp was worthless. The bank's master protocol demanded my physical biometric verification, a live fingerprint scan confirmed in person at the regional federal bank headquarters, accompanied by a specialized notarized affidavit establishing my uncoerced consent. Colin had absolutely no knowledge this clause existed. He had been operating on the arrogant assumption that his forged medical document handed him the keys to everything. He believed the power of attorney was an invincible shield, but he had never once troubled himself to read the foundational bylaws of the empire he was so hungry to inherit. Leonard's eyes widened as the full brilliance of the mechanism landed on him. He saw it immediately. The East Houston Distribution Center sale, priced at $15 million, crossed the 30% threshold of our current liquid valuation without question. Colin was walking directly onto the trigger plate of a massive financial landmine. I walked Leonard through exactly what Monday morning would look like. Colin would log into the executive banking portal. He would upload the signed purchase agreement from his brother-in-law with complete confidence. He would attach the fraudulent power of attorney. He would initiate the $15 million wire transfer toward the offshore Cayman account, fully convinced he was seconds away from a life of comfortable, unreachable freedom. The bank's automated system would receive the request and immediately run the master operating agreement for compliance. It would detect the massive asset liquidation instantly. It would search for my biometric verification. When it failed to locate my fingerprint, the system would not simply decline the transaction. It would automatically trigger a catastrophic loan call. A loan call is the financial equivalent of detonating a charge at the base of a structure. The federal bank, registering a massive, unauthorized move against its collateral assets, would immediately declare the company in a state of critical default. Every line of credit, every corporate mortgage, and every operational account carrying the Merit name would be frozen instantly and permanently. The $15 million would be locked inside a federal holding vault, untouchable by anyone. But the consequences did not end there. The automated security protocols would generate a high-priority suspicious activity report flagging the entire transaction as a potential large-scale fraud and money laundering operation. The system would dispatch these comprehensive dossiers directly to the Financial Crimes Division of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the Internal Revenue Service, and the Securities and Exchange Commission. Colin would not simply fail to collect his money. He would accidentally seal himself inside a financial vault and trip the silent alarm in the same motion, drawing every federal agency in the country straight to his door. Leonard let out a low whistle, shaking his head slowly. He called it a masterpiece of corporate warfare. He understood that by letting Colin initiate the wire transfer, we were compelling him to hand-deliver the definitive proof of his own federal crimes directly to the authorities. No private investigators required, no bruising civil battle to wade through. We simply had to sit back and allow the automated banking system to execute my son for his treason. The elegance of the poison pill was its complete emotional neutrality. It could not be reasoned with, paid off, or manipulated. I looked down at the encrypted laptop, its screen casting a pale glow across the dark hotel room. We had built the perfect cage, and the rat was sprinting eagerly toward the bait. I told Leonard to shut the laptop and get some rest. The heavy work was done. There was nothing left for either of us to do but wait. The next 48 hours would be a brutal exercise in patience, a silent countdown to the ruin of the boy I had once loved. I settled into the chair and stared out at the deep Texas night, feeling the cold weight of anticipation work its way into my bones. Sunday evening came with a heavy, suffocating slowness. The weekend had been a punishing test of psychological endurance. I sat in the same stiff hotel chair, wrapped in the dim, artificial glow of the laptop screen. Outside my window, the relentless Houston sun finally sank below the horizon, streaking the Texas sky in violent shades of bruised purple and deep orange. Leonard had left a few hours earlier to go home and get the rest he needed, leaving me entirely alone in the quiet suite. The silence was complete, broken only by the steady rhythmic tick of the wall clock. Every second that passed was 1 second closer to the federal banking system coming online. Every minute was another step toward the total annihilation of my own flesh and blood. I didn't eat. I barely touched the tepid water sitting on the desk beside me. My mind was consumed entirely by the chilling reality of what was about to happen. Across town, shielded by the heavy oak doors and wrought iron gates of my custom-built estate, a very different kind of evening was unfolding. I didn't need hidden cameras to know what Colin and Renee were doing. I knew my son. I knew his arrogance. The scene was perfectly clear in my mind. They were celebrating. The grand foyer of my home, a space I had designed to welcome family, was likely buried under expensive, oversized designer luggage. Renee was probably moving between the master bedroom and the hallway, carefully packing silk vacation clothes, designer sunglasses, and her best jewelry. They were preparing for their grand escape to the Cayman Islands. I could almost hear the sharp ring of my finest crystal glasses echoing across the hardwood floors. They were undoubtedly pouring the aged single malt scotch I had been keeping in the study for a worthy occasion. As far as they were concerned, this was the occasion. They had conquered the old man. In their minds, they had pulled off the perfect crime. Colin was likely pacing through my home office, dropping into my heavy leather chair behind the mahogany desk, feeling every inch the titan of industry. He had probably reviewed the forged medical power of attorney one last time, admiring the craftsmanship of his own deception. He genuinely believed the falsified dementia diagnosis was an impenetrable suit of armor. He thought he had outmaneuvered a man who had survived 4 decades of cutthroat commercial real estate. He and Renee were basking in their false victory, laughing at how cleanly they had disposed of me, completely blind to the fact that they were dancing on a floor packed with explosives. Their absolute unearned confidence was the very weapon I was using to destroy them. Back in the cold hotel room, the physical and emotional weight of the past few days pressed deeper into my bones. My chest ached with a dull, persistent throb, not the physical aftermath of the stroke, but the agonizing emotional severance of a bond between a father and his child. I was grieving a ghost. The small boy who used to race down the driveway to meet me when I came home from work was gone, completely. He had been hollowed out and replaced by the greedy, desperate stranger currently filling bags in my house. I understood then that the hardest thing about betrayal isn't the financial wound. It's the horrifying realization that the person you'd take a bullet for is the same person holding the gun. I closed my eyes and let the last wave of grief move through me. I gave myself one final moment of sorrow for the family I had believed I had. When I opened my eyes, the grief had burned away, entirely replaced by a cold, hardened resolve that felt like steel. The stakes of the impending morning were monumental. The $15 million wire transfer was sitting in the digital queue waiting for the bank to open. The moment Colin logged in and pushed that transaction through to his offshore shell company, the poison pill would activate on its own. No warning klaxons, no confirmation prompts. The federal banking system would simply close the trap. The loan call would instantly freeze every asset tied to his name, my name, and the entire corporate structure. The automated suspicious activity reports would be dispatched to the Federal Bureau of Investigation without delay. Once daylight arrived, the machinery of the federal justice system would begin turning, and nothing on earth would be able to stop it. I was holding the trigger to a financial nuclear weapon, and my son was begging me to pull it. I glanced at my cell phone resting on the edge of the desk. The screen was dark and silent. Colin had not called to check on me. He hadn't sent a single message to see whether his supposedly sick, mentally deteriorating father had made it safely to the nursing home. He didn't care whether I was lost, frightened, or dying somewhere. That absolute silence was the last confirmation I needed. He was perfectly comfortable with my destruction as long as it guaranteed his escape. He believed he was the apex predator in this situation. I thought he was the wolf who had successfully cut the weakest from the herd. He was badly mistaken. He was nothing but blind prey, wandering contentedly into a steel-jawed trap, too fixated on the bait to see what surrounded it. The digital clock in the corner of my laptop shifted from 11:59 to midnight. Sunday was finished. Monday had arrived in the dark. The city below my window grew incredibly still, as though holding its breath in anticipation of what was coming. I leaned forward in the chair and rested my hands on the edge of the desk. The waiting was nearly over. In just a few hours, the sun would come up. The banks would open, and Colin would make his final fatal move. I stared at the black screen of my phone, knowing his arrogance would eventually force one last act of cruelty before he tried to disappear. I sat in the complete silence of the room, fully ready for the storm. The hours ground on with a punishing weight, each tick of the wall clock ringing like a hammer blow in the empty hotel room. I stayed motionless in the stiff chair, watching the shadows lengthen and shift across the gray carpet as the streetlights flickered outside. My mind held no hesitation. I had released the final remnants of parental mercy. I was no longer a father trying to correct a wayward child. I was a sovereign defending the boundaries of his life's work against an invader. The air conditioning unit maintained its low, steady drone, a dull backdrop to the last hours of my former life. I knew Colin well enough to see his final move coming. Men built on deep insecurity always need the last word. They cannot pocket their prize and slip quietly into the shadows. They have to gloat. They have to make certain their victim feels the full, sharp sting of their perceived superiority. I kept my eyes fixed on the dark rectangle of my phone, knowing that his bloated ego would eventually force him to reach out. He needed to twist the knife one final time to feed his own fragile pride. At exactly 2:14 in the morning, the darkness of the room was shattered by the sudden glare of my phone screen. The device rattled hard against the scratched laminate nightstand, splitting the silence wide open. I didn't flinch. I didn't reach for it immediately. I turned my head and studied the glowing notification banner. The name Colin Merritt lit up the darkness, a name that now felt completely foreign to me. I extended a steady hand, fingers calm and unhurried, and unlocked the screen. There it was, the message that would permanently sever the bloodline between us. You are no longer part of this family. We will move on without you. Do not come back. The words sat perfectly still on the glowing display, carrying the cold, sterile cruelty of a corporate termination letter. I read the message 3 times and let the full malice of it settle over me. He had sent it from the comfort of my own home, probably standing in my living room, absolutely certain he had won the final victory. He wanted me to spend whatever remained of my supposedly dementia-riddled life, knowing that my own son had deliberately erased me from existence. He wanted me crushed under the weight of total abandonment. But as I stared at those words, I felt no abandonment. I felt entirely free. That text message was the last piece of proof I needed that I owed him absolutely nothing. He had voluntarily surrendered his place as my son, releasing me from any remaining moral obligation to shield him from what was coming. The guilt that had been quietly threatening to fracture my resolve evaporated, completely replaced by a pure, uncluttered focus. I tapped the reply field. The keyboard appeared on screen, waiting. A weaker man might have typed a furious paragraph demanding answers, begging for reason, or firing off legal threats. But I understood that any show of emotion would only inflate his ego further. It would confirm his fantasy of control. I had no interest in exchanging words with a dead man walking. I only needed him to know his terms had been received. I typed a single 4-letter word. Okay. I held it on screen for a moment, appreciating how much was contained in its simplicity. It was not a surrender. It was a receipt. It was the quiet acknowledgement of a general observing his enemy march directly into a minefield. I pressed send. The small message floated up on screen, a wordless and permanent close to 42 years of fatherhood. I placed the phone face down on the desk, cutting off the glare, and returned my attention to the heavy encrypted laptop. The Ghost protocol was still running on the screen, its intricate lines of code waiting patiently for my final instruction. The timeline had caught up to the present. The circle was fully closed. I was back where the nightmare had started, but everything around me had changed. I was no longer a victim absorbing a sudden ambush. I was the architect of the counterattack. I set my fingers on the keyboard and drew one slow, deep breath to steady the adrenaline coursing through my veins. The trap was already embedded in the master operating agreement, but I needed to manually arm the poison pill to make certain there were no digital gaps for Colin to slip through when the banks came online. I opened the master security console inside the hidden executive portal. I moved through 3 layers of biometric verification, confirming my identity by fingerprint and retinal scan. The system handed me full administrative control. I located the specific financial covenant governing the East Houston distribution centers. I executed a manual override command, locking the digital trigger firmly into position. I entered the final authorization code, a sequence of numbers that existed only in my memory, and pressed the enter key. The laptop screen flashed a solid green for a fraction of a second before reverting to the standard dashboard. A small clinical notification box materialized at the center of the monitor. Override command confirmed. Security protocols armed. The point of no return had been crossed. The trap was live. The digital jaws of the federal banking system now hung open, waiting for Colin to take his final fatal step. I eased back slowly into the stiff chair, listening to the quiet, steady hum of the laptop fan. There was no undoing any of this now. The board was set, the pieces fixed in place, and the absolute destruction of the son I had raised was now entirely inevitable and thoroughly deserved. The first pale light of Monday morning began seeping in around the edges of the hotel curtains, painting faint strips across the walls. I hadn't slept for a single moment. Yet I felt a strange, unnatural surge of energy coursing through my veins. The small digital clock on the encrypted laptop read exactly 8 in the morning. On the East Coast, the financial markets were already stirring and the central servers of the federal banking system were humming to life. I sat perfectly still, eyes locked on the master dashboard of my corporate network. The room around me was completely silent. But in the digital world, a monumental storm was already forming. I knew Colin's travel schedule. He and Renee were booked on a first-class flight to the Cayman Islands at 11:00 that morning. To make that flight, Colin needed the $15 million to clear the escrow account and route into his offshore holding company. He would not sit on it. The anxiety gnawing at him and the crushing weight of his $12 million debt to the Shadow Syndicate would force him to move the money at the earliest possible moment. He probably had the banking app open on his phone in the back of a car heading toward the airport, thumb hovering over the screen. At exactly 8:05, the laptop screen flickered. A small pulsing yellow icon appeared in the upper right corner of the transaction log. A pending outbound wire transfer had just been initiated. The requested amount was exactly $15 million. The destination was the offshore shell company Leonard had uncovered. The authorizing signature on the digital request belonged to Colin Merritt, operating under the power of attorney he had forged while I lay in a hospital bed. I leaned forward, my heart driving a slow, heavy beat against my ribs. He had actually done it. He had taken the bait without the faintest awareness of the steel jaws waiting in the dark around it. For a few agonizing milliseconds, the transaction status held at yellow. The bank's massive server farms were processing the request, reading the routing numbers, confirming the available balance, and validating the power of attorney. Under normal circumstances, the yellow icon would simply turn green. The money would vanish instantly into the ether, and the empire I had built over 40 years would be dealt a fatal, unrecoverable blow. But this was not a normal scenario. I held my breath, watching the small yellow circle pulse on the dark screen. Then, without warning, it disappeared, replaced by a glaring red warning triangle. The system had found the wall. The automated intelligence of the federal banking network had scanned the transaction and immediately flagged that a $15 million liquidation vastly exceeded the 30% threshold of the company's net worth. The poison pill protocol engaged with ruthless, emotionless efficiency. The system instantly searched for the mandatory secondary authorization. It scanned for my physical biometric fingerprint and the specialized notarized affidavit confirming my uncoerced consent. When it found nothing, the banking architecture did not simply decline the transfer. It reacted exactly as it had been built to react to a massive hostile breach. The screen on my laptop erupted in a cascade of automated alerts. The status of the $15 million shifted instantly from pending to frozen. A secondary alert confirmed that the loan call contingency had been successfully triggered. In a matter of seconds, the bank automatically suspended every operational account, every corporate credit line, and every card associated with Merit Commercial Real Estate. The great vault doors of my empire slammed shut from the inside, trapping Colin's stolen funds in an impenetrable federal holding cell. But the digital guillotine had not finished its fall. By attempting to move that sum of money offshore under a flagged protocol, Colin had tripped the highest-level security wire in the American banking system. My screen displayed a rapid sequence of confirmation receipts as the bank's automated compliance engine generated multiple suspicious activity reports. These were not internal memos. These were high-priority, legally mandated alerts triggered by suspected major financial crimes. I watched in grim silence as the system automatically compiled the data. It packaged the forged power of attorney, the details of the offshore Cayman account, the link to the Delaware shell company managed by Renee's brother, and the $15 million wire request into a single airtight file. Within seconds, these comprehensive dossiers were dispatched directly to the secure servers of the Federal Bureau of Investigation's White-Collar Crime Division, the Internal Revenue Service, and the Treasury Department. Colin believed he was quietly claiming his inheritance. Instead, he had just broadcast a meticulously documented confession of federal wire fraud and international money laundering to the most powerful law enforcement agencies in the country. The federal trap had snapped shut with bone-crushing force. I slowly released the breath I'd been holding. The red warning alert stayed frozen on the screen, a stark and absolute testament to the power of preparation. The money was safe. The company, though temporarily frozen, sat completely beyond the reach of his destructive greed. I shut the laptop and dragged a hand across my exhausted face. No joy came with this victory. There is no triumph in watching your own son dismantle his life, even when he has earned every bit of it. The silent hotel room felt several degrees colder than before. The digital execution had gone off without a flaw, but the human wreckage was only now beginning to surface. At this moment, Colin was almost certainly slumped in a VIP airport lounge, staring at a declined transaction on his phone, utterly incapable of grasping the scale of the catastrophe that had just swallowed him whole. He was carrying $12 million in debt to violent creditors. His escape funds were locked in federal custody, and the FBI was actively working through his file. The clock on the wall kept ticking forward. The moment for the final confrontation had arrived. The sun had climbed fully above the Houston skyline, throwing a hard, bright glare across the sweeping glass facades of George Bush Intercontinental Airport. Inside the sprawling terminal complex, the atmosphere was a particular blend of controlled chaos and high-end polish. Colin and Renee moved through the automatic sliding doors of Terminal D with the easy confidence of people who had never once questioned their own entitlement, looking every inch the portrait of young inherited wealth. Renee trailed matching designer luggage in a resort ensemble, while Colin wore a tailored suit, his bearing radiating the arrogant certainty of a man who believed he had already won. They walked past the long economy lines without a glance and headed straight to the exclusive first-class check-in counter. Colin practically flung his passports and the heavy corporate platinum card onto the polished granite surface, casually instructing the agent to process the final upgrade fees and international departure taxes for their flight to the Cayman Islands. The ticketing agent ran the heavy metal card through the terminal. The machine answered with a sharp negative beep. She frowned slightly, offered a small apology, and tried again. Another sharp beep. She looked up at Colin, her smile beginning to falter. "I'm sorry, sir, but this card is being declined. Do you have another form of payment?" Colin scoffed, rolling his eyes with visible annoyance. He told her it was a simple security glitch triggered by the international destination. He reached into his designer wallet and produced his personal black card, a line of credit deeply tied to the corporate accounts. He handed it across with a dismissive flick of his wrist. The agent swiped the second card. The machine beeped again, showing the exact same error code. Renee shifted uncomfortably beside him, glancing around to check whether anyone in the VIP lane had noticed. Colin's confident smirk began to fracture. He snatched both cards back from the counter, his face flooding with sudden embarrassment. He told the agent to hold their bags while he phoned his private wealth manager to sort out the computer error. Colin stepped away from the desk, fingers moving fast across his smartphone screen. He pulled up the encrypted banking application he had used barely an hour earlier to initiate the $15 million wire transfer. He keyed in his passwords, fully expecting to see a zero balance and a pending confirmation notice. Instead, the screen blazed a bright red error message. Access denied. Account suspended by order of primary account holder. Colin stopped breathing. The busy noise of the airport terminal dropped away entirely, replaced by a loud, ringing silence pressing in on him from every direction. He refreshed the application. Access denied. He attempted to log into his personal checking account. Access denied. He tried his savings. Access denied. A cold, suffocating wave of pure terror broke over him. The $15 million was not sitting in any offshore account. It was completely frozen. The only person on Earth with the biometric authority to trigger a systemic lockdown of that kind was the man he had left for dead. I sat in the quiet hotel room watching my phone, and the screen suddenly lit up. The caller ID showed Colin's name. I didn't answer. I let it ring through to voicemail, wanting to track the exact progression of his psychological unraveling. A minute later, the first voicemail notification chimed. I pressed play and listened through the still room. Colin's voice was tight, wrapped in a thin shell of forced authority. "Dad, I'm at the airport and there's a massive glitch with the corporate accounts. The bank locked me out. I need you to call the wealth manager right now and authorize an override. Call me back immediately." He still believed he was in command. He still took me for the confused, frail old man who could be steered with a firm tone. I left the phone where it was. 5 minutes later, it rang again, then 5 more times in quick succession. I ignored every one. By the 10th missed call, the voicemails had shifted register entirely. The arrogant entitlement had drained away, replaced by rising, frantic bewilderment. "Dad, where are you? I called the assisted living facility and they said you never checked in. What did you do to the accounts? The wire transfer didn't go through. You don't understand the position you're putting me in right now. Pick up the phone." I was beginning to understand that the old man was not simply confused. The old man was fighting back deliberately. The calls kept coming. A relentless digital barrage of desperation. 20 calls, 30 calls. I listened to his voicemails as he paced the terminal, his world coming apart around him. By the 25th call, the anger had dissolved entirely into naked, pathetic pleading. "Dad, please, I'm begging you. You have to unfreeze the accounts. Renee is crying. The ticketing agents are calling security because we can't move our bags. You are ruining my life. Please just answer the phone. I'll explain everything, I promise. Just fix the bank." But it was the 43rd voicemail that finally captured the full, terrifying truth of his situation. His voice was no longer a demand or a plea. It had collapsed into a breathless, shattered whisper, the voice of a man staring directly into his own grave. "Dad, they are going to kill me. The people I owe money to, they don't care about excuses. If I don't wire that cash today, they are going to fine me. And if the bank reported the wire block to the federal authorities, I'm going to prison. I have nothing left. My cards are dead. My cash is gone. Please, I'm your son. Don't let them do this to me. Save me." I listened to that final voicemail twice. He was telling the absolute truth for the first time. He was no longer the brilliant architect of a hostile corporate takeover. He was just a terrified boy who had played a dangerous game far outside his depth and lost everything. The trap had functioned flawlessly. The system had shut him out completely. The federal authorities were undoubtedly closing in, and the shadow syndicate was waiting. I looked at the 43 missed calls glowing on my screen. The time had come to finally pick up. I walked over to the small coffee maker sitting on the hotel counter, set a white porcelain cup beneath the spout, and pressed the brew button, watching the dark liquid slowly fill the mug. The rich scent of roasted coffee drifted through the room, lending a brief, ordinary comfort to a Monday morning that was anything but. The cell phone on the desk began to vibrate again, the 44th call. I lifted the warm mug, took one slow, deliberate sip of the bitter coffee, and walked back to the makeshift command center. I picked up the phone, swiped the green icon, and raised it to my ear. I offered no hello, no fatherly greeting. I simply stood by the window and listened to the chaotic soundtrack pouring through the tiny speaker-muffled PA announcements echoing through the terminal, the sharp clatter of heavy luggage wheels crossing polished tile, and the rapid, ragged breathing of my son. For a few agonizing seconds, Colin didn't even realize the call had connected. He was cursing under his breath, muttering panicked profanities to his wife. Then the line went dead quiet as he checked the screen. "Dad!" He screamed the word with such raw, savage force that I had to pull the phone physically away from my ear. "Dad, what did you do? Unfreeze the accounts right now. You have to call the wealth manager this exact second and tell them it was a computer mistake. Tell them my medical power of attorney is perfectly valid. Tell them to push the international wire through immediately. I am not playing games with you. Unfreeze the money before you ruin everything." His voice was completely unrecognizable. The arrogant vice president who had blocked my front door just 3 days ago was gone without a trace. In his place was a cornered animal snapping and snarling because he could finally feel the sharp steel teeth of the trap biting deep into his leg. He wasn't asking for my help. He was demanding it from a position of absolute zero. How was demanding total compliance from me, desperately clinging to the crumbling illusion that he still held any real power. I took another slow, unhurried sip of my coffee, letting the warmth settle in my dry throat. I gazed out the large glass window at the Houston skyline rising in the distance, the beautiful city I had built myself through decades of honest grinding work. When I spoke, my voice carried the absolute glacial calm of a man holding every winning card. I told him I hadn't done a thing, Colin. The federal bank simply followed the rules that were already in place. When an executive attempts to quietly liquidate 30% of my entire corporate net worth without my physical biometric fingerprint, the system locks down automatically. It is a fail-safe clause I had secretly embedded over 10 years ago, a poison pill. He would have known all about it if he had ever taken the time to actually read the corporate bylaws rather than spending his days scheming to steal my legacy. The silence on the other end was heavy. The busy terminal noise seemed to bleed away entirely, leaving only the wretched sound of Colin drawing a sharp, trembling breath. He stammered, his mind visibly struggling to absorb the devastating revelation. "You knew." He breathed the two words as though they scorched him on the way out. The full, terrifying weight of it was settling over him that I had never been the oblivious victim he'd taken me for. "I knew everything," I said, my voice cutting through his shock with surgical calm. "I knew about the forged medical documents. I knew you bribed that corrupt neurologist to have me declared mentally incompetent. I knew about the fire sale of the East Houston distribution centers. And I know about the Delaware shell company registered in Renee's younger brother's name. You genuinely believed you could sell my own commercial buildings back to yourself and launder $15 million right under my nose." Colin let out a choked, strangled sound, a raw noise of pure, uncut terror. "Dad, please," he begged, his voice fracturing into a high, hysterical pitch that carried across the terminal. "You don't understand what's happening. I owe them money. $12 million. They margin called my crypto portfolio last week. They are going to hurt me, Dad. These are dangerous people. They know exactly where I live. They know where Renee is right now. You have to let the transfer go through today. I'll pay back every cent. I'll sign the entire company over to you outright. Just give me the $15 million and let me get on this plane to the Cayman Islands." A deep, heavy coldness settled into my aching chest. He was still trying to negotiate his way out of the inferno. He still believed that enough money thrown at the problem could undo the catastrophic wreckage he had deliberately caused. He still clung to the foolish notion that his old father would swoop in and pull him from the violent pit he had willingly dug for himself. I took one final long sip of my dark coffee and set the porcelain mug down firmly on the hotel desk. I leaned in closer to the phone and drew a slow, steadying breath before replying with ice-cold precision. "You told me I wasn't part of the family anymore. The federal bank agrees. Have a safe flight, son." I began to pull the phone away from my ear, standing in the quiet room and simply listening to him screaming my name. It was a long, agonizing wail of total, suffocating despair. I moved my thumb toward the glowing red button, ready to cut the connection and end the nightmare for good. But just as I was about to press it, something in the audio pouring through the speaker shifted sharply and caught my attention. Colin had stopped screaming my name. That agonizing wail was cut abruptly short, replaced by a sudden, breathless gasp. The ambient noise of the busy terminal was broken by the heavy, synchronized thud of tactical boots striking polished tile. I slowly brought the phone back to my ear, pressing the speaker flush against my skin. I stood perfectly still in the hotel room, holding my breath, a silent witness to the exact moment my son's empire of lies came apart completely. Through the tiny speaker, a booming, authoritative voice sliced through the surrounding chatter. It commanded Colin Merritt to step away from the ticketing counter and keep his hands fully visible. This was not the measured, deferential tone of an airport security officer or a customer relations manager. It carried the unmistakable, crushing weight of federal law enforcement. I heard the distinct rustle of heavy gear and the sharp clatter of walkie-talkies. Colin let out a pathetic, trembling stammer. He tried to summon the arrogant authority he had always used to cow lower-level staff at the firm. He demanded to know what was happening, declared himself a highly respected commercial real estate executive, attempting to board a flight, and threatened to have his lawyers sue the airline for harassment. His voice was shaking so badly the threats came out sounding like the desperate whining of a frightened child. The federal agent didn't entertain his performance for a moment. The officer stated with cold, absolute precision that they were executing a federal arrest warrant issued by the White-Collar Crime Division of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The agent read out the charges aloud right there in the middle of the crowded terminal: federal wire fraud, international money laundering, forgery of medical documents, conspiracy to commit corporate embezzlement. Every word landed like a hammer blow, systematically demolishing the fragile glass structure Colin had built around himself. I could hear the collective gasp ripple through the surrounding passengers and ticketing staff as the full gravity of the scene became public. Colin was completely frozen. There was nowhere to run, no way to fight. He was ensnared in a cage woven entirely from his own greed. And then the most poetic, most wretched moment of the entire morning unfolded. Renee, the woman who had stood on my front porch just 3 days earlier wearing a smug smile of conquest, suddenly understood that the luxury vessel she had climbed aboard was going down fast. The instant she heard the agents recite the criminal charges and watched heavy metal handcuffs being drawn out, her loyalty evaporated without a trace. Without a single beat of hesitation, she turned on her husband with the vicious ferocity of a cornered rattlesnake. Her shrill, panicked voice exploded through the phone line. She began screaming at the top of her lungs, frantically working to separate herself from the radioactive wreckage. She told the federal agents she had absolutely nothing to do with any of it. She cried out that it was all Colin's idea, that he had pressured her into going along, that he was completely out of his mind. She threw him directly beneath the moving bus, rapidly unloading the full details of his crimes in a desperate bid to save herself. She confessed on the spot that Colin had bribed the doctor for the fraudulent dementia diagnosis and had manipulated her brother into opening the Delaware Shell Company. She sobbed theatrically, claiming she was nothing more than a terrified wife acting under extreme emotional duress. The entire toxic architecture of their marriage imploded in a matter of seconds. Colin, blindsided completely by his wife's instantaneous betrayal, unleashed a gut-wrenching scream of raw fury. He cursed her out, calling her a traitor and a gold digger, reminding her at full volume that she was the one who had happily packed her designer bags for the Cayman Islands. He screamed that she was going to federal prison right alongside him. Their polished, flawless facade shattered into 1,000 ugly fragments. They were no longer the glamorous power couple of Houston society. They were two cornered criminals tearing each other apart in the middle of a public airport surrounded by armed federal agents and dozens of recording cell phones. The federal agents quickly lost patience with the domestic spectacle. I heard the sharp metallic ratcheting of heavy steel handcuffs being secured around my son's wrists. The cold, precise click of the locking mechanism traveled through the phone line, a sound that marked the absolute and permanent end of his freedom. A second agent stepped forward and began reading Colin his Miranda rights, the standard legal recitation cutting through his pathetic, breathless sobbing. He was weeping like a broken child, his spirit ground to nothing beneath the crushing weight of his own towering hubris. Through the noise of Renee's hysterical screaming and the stern commands of the arresting officers, I heard Colin whimper one final desperate plea into the open phone line. He called out for his dad, begging me to please wake up and tell him it was all just a terrible dream. I stood in the silent hotel room, the morning sun now flooding the space with full light, and closed my eyes. There was no joy anywhere inside me, only a deep, hollow exhaustion. The cancer had been entirely cut from my life. The poison was gone. I said nothing more. I slowly brought the phone down from my ear, glanced at the call timer still ticking on the glowing screen, and pressed the red button with finality. The nightmare was finished. I breathed deeply. 3 months later, the punishing Texas heat had at last begun to release its grip, giving way to a sharp, unforgiving autumn chill. I found myself seated on a hard wooden bench inside the federal courthouse in downtown Houston. The courtroom's grand architecture, soaring ceilings, heavy mahogany paneling felt like an appropriate stage for the final act of this tragic play. I was dressed in my finest tailored suit, the same one I used to wear to board meetings back when Colin was still a junior executive trying to earn my approval. I sat motionless, posture, straight expression, giving nothing away. I was not there as a grieving father. I was there as the primary witness for the federal prosecution. The wheels of justice had moved with surprising speed, largely because the digital evidence captured through my poison pill protocol was entirely irrefutable. The federal prosecutors had no need to construct a complicated narrative. Colin had handed them a perfectly assembled package containing every last detail of his sweeping conspiracy. The first head to roll had not been my son's, but that of the corrupt neurologist who had confidently signed his name to my falsified dementia diagnosis. The man stood before the judge visibly sweating, bearing no resemblance to the arrogant medical professional who had so casually condemned a healthy man to a care facility. The prosecutors dismantled his entire career in under an hour. They presented financial records documenting the substantial cash bribes Colin had funneled into the doctor's offshore accounts. They brought in my primary care physician, who testified plainly to my sound cognitive health. The medical board didn't hesitate. His license was permanently revoked on the spot, and he was immediately remanded to federal custody to await his own trial on charges of criminal fraud and medical malpractice. Watching him led away in handcuffs brought me no joy, only a deep, quiet sense of vindication. He had betrayed his sacred oath for a handful of silver, treating an old man's life as a cheap commodity to be traded in the dark. But the doctor was merely a preamble. The main event was the sentencing of the man who had architected the entire nightmare. The heavy wooden doors at the side of the courtroom swung open, and 2 armed federal marshals brought my son into the room. Colin was completely unrecognizable. The expensive designer suits and the arrogant bearing had been stripped entirely away, replaced by the drab, humiliating reality of a shapeless orange prison jumpsuit. His face was pale, and drawn eyes darting around the room with the nervous energy of a trapped animal. He looked remarkably small. When his gaze finally found mine across the crowded courtroom, I saw a silent, desperate plea for mercy swimming in his hollow eyes. I didn't blink. I didn't look away. I stared back at him with the cold detachment of a complete stranger. The judge read the charges aloud, his voice filling the room with absolute authority. Federal wire fraud, international money laundering conspiracy to commit corporate embezzlement. The judge noted the deliberate malice underlying the crimes, emphasizing how Colin had weaponized both the legal and medical systems to prey upon his own elderly father. There was no leniency offered. The gavel fell with a sharp, echoing crack. 15 years in a federal penitentiary without the possibility of early parole. The thick walls of that federal prison were, with bitter irony, the only thing standing between him and the violent shadow syndicate he still owed $12 million. His life as he had known it was permanently and irreversibly finished. Renee, meanwhile, was waging her own desperate fight across the aisle. She had filed for divorce the morning after the airport arrest, aggressively attempting to reinvent herself as an innocent, victimized wife who had been entirely manipulated by a controlling husband. She retained high-priced defense attorneys and cried theatrically for the cameras positioned outside the courthouse. But the federal prosecutors were extraordinarily thorough. They had traced the Delaware shell company directly to her younger brother, and they found her digital signatures embedded throughout the fraudulent loan origination documents. Her efforts to throw Colin under the bus had done nothing to save her. She was formally indicted as a primary criminal conspirator. The judge ordered her assets frozen and confiscated her passport. She sat at the defense table, her carefully maintained composure destroyed by genuine tears of terror, coming to terms with the fact that her polished country club existence was about to be exchanged for a concrete cell. Her brother was already cooperating with the authorities, trading everything he knew for a reduced sentence. The toxic alliance they had forged to dismantle my life had consumed them both from within. As the proceedings drew to a close and the courtroom began to empty, the lead prosecutor crossed over and shook my hand, expressing his appreciation for my steady cooperation throughout. I nodded quietly, collected my coat, and walked out through the heavy wooden doors into the bright Texas afternoon. The air felt light. The crushing weight of betrayal that had pressed down on me for the past 3 months had finally lifted. I descended the wide granite courthouse steps, the distant sounds of city traffic filling the air around me. I had survived the ultimate betrayal. I had defended the empire I had spent a lifetime constructing. The rot had been completely excised from the foundation. The legal battles were behind me now, and justice had been delivered in the cold light of day. But standing on that pavement and looking toward the horizon, I understood that my work wasn't entirely done. I still had to rebuild the company's future and determine what to do with the considerable wealth that was now entirely mine to command, free from the grasping hands of those who had tried to take it all. The next chapter was beginning to open. The very first thing I did after walking out of the federal courthouse was reclaim the physical space that had been so deliberately taken from me. I drove straight to the custom-built estate, the very place where the locks had been changed and my dignity so openly challenged on that bright morning. The heavy oak doors were unlocked this time. My legal team had already cleared out whatever traces Colin and Renee had left behind. I moved through the grand foyer, my footsteps ringing against the hardwood floors. The house felt different. The residue of their betrayal still clung to certain shadowed corners, but the air itself felt remarkably clean and unburdened. I brought in a professional crew to renovate the spaces they had occupied. I wanted no visual echoes of the people who had worked to erase my existence. I changed the heavy brass locks once more, and this time I handed the spare keys only to those who had genuinely earned my trust. My loyal housekeeper, who had wept when she was falsely informed I had been sent away to a facility, returned to her post and greeted me with a warm embrace. The vast house gradually became a home again. It was no longer a fortress built to shelter an ungrateful family. It was a peaceful sanctuary, and it was mine. I spent the first several weeks simply settling back into the quiet rhythm of my own life. I rose early, had my coffee out on the back patio, and watched the sun climb over the gardens my late wife had so lovingly tended. The silence, which had once felt like a weight pressing in on me inside that sterile hotel room, now felt like a genuine gift. I had successfully defended the walls of my castle, and I could at last enjoy the peace within them. With my personal life firmly in order, I turned my full attention back to the business empire. The Twin East Houston distribution centers, the very assets Colin had frantically tried to liquidate for a meager $15 million, were officially returned to the open commercial market. I did not rush the process. I allowed my seasoned executive team to carry out the proper environmental studies, the thorough structural inspections, and the extensive legal negotiations. 4 months later, we closed the deal with a major multinational logistics firm for $29 million. It was a significant financial victory, but the sheer size of the number no longer carried quite the same weight for me. Those quiet nights in the hotel room had made something clear. Hoarding enormous wealth for a bloodline that had gone entirely rotten was nothing more than a fool's errand. I resolved to build a different kind of legacy altogether. I directed a substantial portion of those real estate proceeds toward establishing the Merit Foundation. We built a comprehensive, fully funded entrepreneurial scholarship program dedicated entirely to underprivileged youth across the greater Houston area. I wanted to find the driven young men and women who carried that same relentless hunger I had felt when I was clawing my own business up from nothing. I wanted to provide them with starting capital, professional mentorship, and the essential resources to build empires of their own. I now spend my afternoons working through their business plans, listening to their ambitious and heartfelt pitches, watching tired eyes come alive with genuine, unmistakable hope. These young people were not lurking in the background waiting for me to die so they could take my money. They were hungry to learn how to earn it for themselves. There is something profoundly humbling about watching a young person's entire trajectory shift because you simply decided to believe in them. I came to understand that my son's failure was not a measure of my worth as a mentor, it was a measure of his own deeply flawed character. Through their effort and determination, my legacy would go on growing, rooted in ground that was actually capable of bearing good fruit. I also took the time to completely overhaul the executive board of my commercial real estate company. I proudly elevated the men and women who had stood firm beside me through the darkest stretch, the loyal employees who had raised questions and pushed back when Colin had briefly seized control of the operation. I rewarded their integrity with meaningful equity stakes and permanent leadership positions. Leonard Stratton, my tenacious and brilliant attorney who had engineered the digital trap, officially stepped away from his demanding private practice and came aboard as a senior executive advisor. We still drink terrible black coffee together in the mornings, only now we do it talking about the future of the charitable foundation rather than mapping out aggressive corporate countermeasures against my own flesh and blood. I learned through genuine agony that the family you build by choice is often far steadier and more dependable than the one you are simply born into by accident. I am 75 years old, and yet I carry a renewed sense of deep, unstoppable purpose. The mild stroke was a physical warning shot. The betrayal that followed was a spiritual awakening. I no longer waste a single moment trying to accommodate or provide for people who see me as nothing more than a breathing bank account. I guard my peace and my happiness with the same fierce, uncompromising resolve I once reserved for protecting my financial empire. The storm that was designed to break me only swept the ground clean for something far better. Blood makes you related, but loyalty makes you family. Sometimes the hardest thing a father can do is stand back and let his child bear the full weight of what their own greed has built. That is where this road brought me, not to bitterness, but to clarity. Colin sat in a federal courtroom in an orange jumpsuit, and I walked out of that building into the afternoon light carrying something I had almost forgotten I was allowed to feel: peace. I lost months of my life to that betrayal. I lost sleep. I nearly lost the company I spent 5 decades building from the ground up. But I believe God allowed me to go through that fire for a reason, because what came out the other side was a man who finally understood the difference between a legacy of money and a legacy of meaning. The Merit Foundation, those scholarship recipients, the loyal people I elevated to lead beside me, that is what I will leave behind. Not the warehouses, not the wire transfers, the people. If these grandpa revenge stories have taught me anything worth passing on, let me give it to you straight. First, protect what you built. A poison pill clause, a trusted attorney, a paper trail, these are not signs of paranoia. They are signs of wisdom earned the hard way. Second, silence is not weakness. The most powerful move I made was saying nothing and watching carefully. Confrontation without evidence is just noise. Third, the family you choose through loyalty will outlast the family that came to you by blood. Choose carefully who holds your trust. Fourth, when someone tells you that you are no longer needed, that is not their decision to make. It never was. If these father stories speak to something you have lived or someone you know is quietly going through something similar, please share this with them. Leave a comment below and tell me what stayed with you. And if you are not already part of this community, subscribe to Grandpa's Revenge. New stories come every week, and every one of them is told for the people who need to hear it most. Thank you for sitting with me through this one. I will see you in the next chapter.